Well, I'm hoping that a few more people join us this evening, but this is our first experiment with an evening Arbor Week event. So spread the word, because there will be another event coming Thursday night with 3 people here who are in the audience, plus 1 who is.
Yeah. Or pizza.
Yeah. Well, that's tomorrow night. We'll get to that in just a minute. Okay. Well, I'm Ken Stoltz, and I'm a volunteer with and a donor to the State of Montana Arboretum. And I hope most of you know that the University of Montana campus is the State Arboretum, but if you don't, by the end of the week, we certainly hope you will. I want to welcome you to our second Arbor Week event, and we have additional 4 events coming up. Tomorrow night, an Arboretum Community Night at Kettle House 3, the Byron Room, from 5 to 8. Another presentation Thursday night here with a similar theme, trees and climate change, but act locally. Friday, we have our Arbor Day celebration beginning at 12:15, which will include traditional planting of an Arbor Day trees, plural this year, as well as unveiling our new interpretive signs in the root. And if you don't know where the root is, that is just north of Main Hall. It has a large circle of rocks with a subalpine fir in the middle of it, some concrete that's supposed to look like a tree ring, and you'll see some yarn-bombed trees and some labeled trees and some Tree Campus USA signs, which all ought to help you. But it's just north of Main Hall, northeast side of the Oval, west of the University Center.
There may be dogs and mini horses.
Yeah, there may be dogs and mini horses and 100 preschoolers there, so it's going to be tough to miss. I want to acknowledge some people who made, and organizations that made tonight possible. First of all, the presentation of this evening's being recorded by MCAT as part of a media assistant grant donated to the State of Montana Arboretum. And I want to extend a thanks to our MCAT videographer tonight, Mary Gray. And a big thanks to the other organizations who partnered with us this Arbor Week at the State of Montana Arboretum. Trees for Missoula, the White Bark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, Climate Smart Missoula, the Environmental Studies Program, and last but not least, the W.A. Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. Finally, I want to thank the over 100 individuals and organizations, too much coffee, that donated last year in our Root for the Arboretum campaign. I would hope that some of you here this evening might choose to donate this year in support of your State of Montana Arboretum. Our speaker this evening is Solomon Dabrowski, a professor of landscape ecology from the Franke College of Forestry. Rather than my drone on with the CB of Solomon, while you wait impatiently, I'll turn you over to Solomon. Thanks, Solomon.
Thank you, Ken. Well, this is great. Thank you guys for coming. This is fairly intimate, so we could just ask questions even. But I have a presentation that I've prepared in the final week of instruction, so bear with me. I actually enjoyed making this presentation. I've smattered it with some cool pictures, some poetry about trees, a whole range of things, science about trees, which I think is what a lot of you guys are coming here to see tonight. But let's start with why trees and forests. Why are we talking about climate change and trees and forests? Forests are the dominant terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. They basically comprise the bulk of all biomass that you see on the planet, 80% based on some recent calculations. They harbor the majority of species on Earth. Additionally, trees in particular are sentinels of past climate changes. So we're here to talk about climate change, and so trees are a great vehicle in which to discuss climate changes of the past, climate changes that we're experiencing now, and thinking about what we can expect in terms of future changes. And trees are also part of the solution. One of the major strategies that people are putting forward to mitigate against increased CO2 emissions is basically sequestration in trees and forests around the globe. So why trees and forests? I hope that explains why we're focusing on this. And given that you guys are here for Arbor Day, I don't think I have to belabor the point of why trees are cool. But I will, because I love trees. There's all sorts of superlatives that come along with trees. The biggest, the oldest, the tallest. We can go down the list. There's all this back and forth about, is it a fungus or is it this aspen grove on the far right? But if I can't see it and hug it, it doesn't count in my mind. So I don't need to belabor this point, I think, either. Trees really do spark interest amongst people. There's something about trees that caught my attention early on in my life. I'm guessing that many of you guys have had your own experiences in forests that brought you here to this point to support these types of efforts. In addition to the superlatives, trees are the muse for countless poems, books, quotes from John Muir, including this one, which I really like. Between every two pines is a doorway to a new world. That's a picture from a colleague in my department, Andrew Larson, that was taken in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, right here in our own backyard. And we're fortunate. Speaking of fortunate, I feel like I'm one of the most fortunate individuals around because I get paid to teach people about trees, to study trees, and I get to do that every day of the year. And so I get to do it in a lovely place like Missoula, Montana. So first I want to thank you all for being taxpayers that are paying my salary to do something I love. Forests captivate the public's attention as well. That's become really obvious in the last 5 to 10 years, whether it be discussions about bark beetle outbreaks, fire on the landscape, as well as drought-induced mortality events that we seem to increasingly be seeing. That's generating lots of attention as well in terms of press coverage, in terms of interest from our politicians about what we are doing in forests. And not to mention, it's creating labels for beers. Here's Resilience IPA from Butte County. This was made just after the campfire last year. You know it's gone mainstream when Forest Resilience is on a beer label. And the undertow of all of that, this discussion that we've been having as a society, is this issue about climate change. And my talk today is not going to be about climate science. It'll touch on climate science on the periphery. My talk's going to be focusing on this linkage between trees and climate. But I do want to plant a flag and say climate change is real. I think, Steve, you've been making that case for a very long time. We have known for a long time that there is a physical link between CO2 and warming. And so you guys have all seen these types of curves before. The changes are dramatic. When you look at CO2 concentrations over the last 400,000 years, they bob around until roughly about 1950 and then shoot straight up. This isn't a one-off. This is something that's very clear in terms of the scientific record. There's broad agreement. The last assessment I read about this, 98% of climate scientists, or scientists as a whole, believe that climate change is occurring. If you were to go to 100 doctors and 98 of them told you you had cancer and 2 of them said you didn't, would you be concerned? I think the answer is obvious. There have been institutional assessments of warming patterns that are done across the globe, whether it be within our own country, within NOAA and NASA, whether it be the Hadley Center in England, whether it be the Japanese Meteorological Agency. They all come to the same conclusion. This is occurring. It seems to be accelerating. Lastly, we have known this for a really long time. This is not something new that we're bringing to bear. This is a paper published in Science in 1975, the title of which is Climate Change. Are we on the brink of a pronounced global warming? This is by Wally Broecker, who's recently passed this past spring. He was a scientist at Columbia. He did some very simple modeling. You don't need to worry about the details on this table, but he did some really simple modeling, which is to basically make some very simple assumptions about the growth rate of CO2 in the atmosphere and its effect on warming. And that number there, if you can see it, was his projection for 2010, a projection he made in 1975. It's 403 parts per million. Anyone know what the ppm is currently? Don't say, Steve. 410 is the last I looked. Not shabby, made circa 1975.
Well, that was for 2010.
2010, yeah. Here is what he projected was the warming associated with 400 parts per million. 1.1 degrees Celsius. Anyone know basically what it's warmed over that time for? What's that?
1.5 now.
About 1, I think, is the last time I checked. That jive with which about 1 degree Celsius globally. So here you have somebody in 1975 using simple models, basically nailing it. This is the year after I was born, 43 years ago. We've known for 43 years what the outcomes are in terms of the climate system. And here we are, we're still fighting this fight day in and day out. But here's what my talk's about. Trees and climate change. Why we really look to trees to understand the climate system, what the climate system tells us about trees, their distribution. They really are unique sentinels of the climate system. And so today I want to basically capture kind of 3 facets of this, maybe 4 if we have time. One is to really look at the distribution of trees globally, where species are found, and what it tells us about climate. Similarly, what climate can tell us about where trees are. Secondly, I want to talk about the recent past. When I say the recent past, the past 1,000 years, using tree ring records to understand the climate system. Third, I want to talk about the more distant past, using fossil pollen to understand climate changes over longer time frames. All of these give us unique insights in terms of this link between trees and climate. Any discussion about the distribution of trees around the planet needs to start with this gentleman here, Alexander von Humboldt. Those of you who know anything about von Humboldt, he was a Prussian aristocrat. He was a polymath. He was an explorer. He was an exquisite botanist. He was a physical scientist. He was an amazing dude. It was late 1700s, early 1800s, he was funded by King Charles IV from Spain to go on an expedition. So when I go out into the field, I hop in my car, sometimes I get in a plane, and I tend to complain about all the effort that goes into doing that. This guy got on boats, crossed the ocean, had, thousands of pounds of equipment to carry with him to collect specimens, both of plants, animals, as he crossed the globe into South America. In particular, I want to talk about his trip to a volcano which is currently in Ecuador, called Chimborazo. That particular expedition in which they climbed this volcano really was a catalyst to create an entire field of knowledge. It was the beginning of which is biogeography as we know it today. This was his depiction of Chimborazo. It's found in the back of a famous book that he wrote, The Geography of Plants, published in 1807. There's a lot going on in this. This is a big 2 by 3 foot fold-out map that they created. Let's zoom in on it to get a closer look as to some of the things that he was interested in. You can't read any of that, and that's fine. But there are some key things that I want to point out that were apparent in his illustration that was the first time people started really identifying these kinds of traits about the way organisms are distributed in space. First off, you can see that there's zonation in the vegetation types. You see that in the image over on the left. Secondly, you see that there's also a distinction between the vegetation on the windward side and the leeward side of the mountain. All of the names that you see here that you can't actually identify are genuses associated with the dominant plants that he found as he moved up. And they're all located at the relevant heights on the volcano as he moved up. The portions of the plot that you can't read over on the right and left are exquisite measurements of, physical measurements of the meteorology that he came across as he moved up the mountain. Relative humidity, temperature, atmospheric pressure. He took information about the geology. Think about what that would take circa early 1800s. The devices you used back then to actually measure atmospheric pressure are not, built into iWatches or whatever they're called. They were massive pieces of equipment. At the same time, he was collecting specimens as he moved up the mountain. They made it to about 19,000 feet, a little over 19,000 feet on this volcano. That was the highest expedition that had occurred up to that point in time. And they did that collecting scientific data all the way. He was 1,000 feet short of the summit of this mountain. But taking a step back, what are the key things that we learned from this map and his travels to other volcanoes around the world? Because he didn't just hike this volcano. What he saw was that there were consistent patterns across all the volcanoes that he saw. He saw that there was zonation in the vegetation as he moved up the mountain. He saw that there were consistent patterns of how that vegetation changed with temperature, with humidity, and so forth. He saw that there were effects associated. He saw that there were genuses that he saw consistently on different mountains in different places. It's useful to really know your botany in that context. He was one of the first scientists to basically bring together two major disciplines in our scientific endeavor, the physical scientists and the biological scientists. Up to that point, you had biological scientists that were really interested in collecting specimens, cataloging the diversity of things, but that was it. He brought together the physical sciences and said, you know what, they're structured the way things are distributed in space. And climate is the key ingredient in that. He recognized that not only did vegetation structure by elevation, it's structured by latitude. You can find the same types of vegetation at high latitudes in the boreal and in tundra as you do on the tops of mountains. He saw that. He was one of the first to identify what an isotherm was and draw it on the maps. He was one of the first to talk about environmental lapse rates, or lapse rates, which are the change in temperature as you move up a mountain. His effects on science afterwards were dramatic. He inspired Darwin, Thoreau. You can go down the list. You can make a straight line from von Humboldt to the early naturalists who cataloged the diversity of forests within our nation. These were maps that came out of the Department of Interior circa 1884. On the left is the distribution of the genus Pinus, pine trees in North America. On the right is the distribution of the genus Quercus, oak trees. People weren't thinking about these things prior to von Humboldt. From that same set of maps, here's a distribution of forest density across the West, or across the U.S. Let's fast forward to today. I like the old maps better. Better color schemes, a little more muted. We have taken basically the intellectual property of von Humboldt and we've combined it with modern technology and big data to basically tackle the same kinds of questions that von Humboldt was asking back then. On the left here is a map of basically 1.2 billion records that are published online in the GBIF database, the Global Biodiversity Informatics Facility database. This basically gives you information about where species are located anywhere on the planet. And they have over 1.2 billion records that you can query all online. Are you interested in knowing where your pet favorite tree is? You can look it up there. It'll tell you exactly where it is. When you combine that with information, with unprecedented information about climate data that is finally resolved, and we've ever seen climate data that not only is resolved in terms of spatial resolution, but in terms of temporal resolution. Any day of the year we have information about what the climate system looks like, what the climate is across the globe. When you combine those geo-referenced observational data with that level of detail of climate information, it allows you to basically start mapping where organisms live both in geographic space and in climate space. This is a map developed for Abies lasiocarpa, subalpine fir. Somebody just mentioned the subalpine fir over on campus. This is up in the upper left, which is hard to see, but there's a dark gray patch. That's its distribution in geographic space. And if we take that geographic data and we extract what the climate envelope for where that species is found, we see these types of plots. You can't read those either, but these types of plots basically are showing precipitation, for example, on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis, and the black dots are saying where in the domain of North American climate space do you find subalpine fir. This is powerful because it allows us to then ask questions about, well, what happens if climate changes? Where do these species overlap with other species that might be competitors, that might be things that try to eat subalpine fir, for example? We can branch out of North America and look for more broadly, do cross-site comparisons of climate requirements. So upper left is, so all three of the top maps, we're looking at the Pacific Northwest, the South Island of New Zealand, and northern Patagonia. The dark dots represent basically closed canopy temperate forests in those places. And when you map those types of forests onto climate space, this is what you see down here. We see total annual precipitation on the y-axis and mean annual temperature, or mean temperature of the warmest month, on the x-axis. And you see that all three of these types of forests, even though they're thousands of miles apart, they all share similar climate requirements in terms of what they're looking for. And so, what does that mean? Does that mean that if we go to these places, they're the same types of forests? No, of course not. We can look at those forests and see that they have unique differences. Starting over on the left with the Pacific Northwest, we see that they're dominated by conifers, cone-bearing trees. But when we go over to New Zealand and Patagonia, those are angiosperms. They're flowering plants. They're actually broadleaves. But structurally, they look relatively similar in terms of their overall characteristics. But when we look at floristically, they have very few similarities in terms of their phylogenies and the things that led up to them being at those places. So they share similar climate requirements, but they're very different. Different species. They have different disturbance regimes. They adapt to fire differently. So climate isn't everything, but climate can give us some unique insights in terms of what happens in these types of forests. This is an image of a forest in South Island of New Zealand. The only, I wish I had a stick. Yeah, I do, right here. The only native forest in this landscape that I can make out is this patch here of Nothofagus forest, southern beach. The rest, lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine is not native to New Zealand. We have it here in the Northern Rockies. And so this idea of sharing similar climates may not explain lots of things, but it does explain some things like invasibility.
So it's not radiata pine?
No, this is lodgepole pine.
Oh, I'll be darned.
Lodgepole pine taking over vast stretches of some of these places, including places in New Zealand and northern Patagonia. Radiata pine, which is another invasive pine in these areas, was planted for purposes for timber,
Right.
and it's basically invaded these landscapes. But this is unbelievable, man. You can see this whole landscape. They tried to cut it back here, and you can see that's all lodgepole pine forest behind it. What do these forests look like? That's what they look like. There's somebody right there. You can barely see them. That is over 6 feet of growth in a single year. And so these types of invaded forests have a fraction, only a fraction of the native diversity that the native forests have, the Nothofagus forests. They're basically biological deserts under those forests because of the types of invasions occurring. So a point I bring up in all of this is that we can gain a lot of information about the ecology of systems by understanding their climate requirements. Not everything, but we can gain some unique insights. Let's shift gears and talk about the recent past. So, tree rings give us a unique insight into climate over the recent past. The recent past, as I mentioned earlier, I'll say over the last 500 to 1,000 years. I think tree rings are beautiful, so I put a poem up here for you guys. I'll read it so you don't have to. It says, unlike words, tree rings never lie. One year was freezing cold and dark. The sun was hidden in the sky. I tasted brimstone, and it left its mark, like a noose tightening, like a charred wreath. What is this thing, I thought, called death? You can read me like a book. Open me up and take a look. History laid bare, a garland here, a crown there, plain as a pikestaff for all to see. Each year jotted down by me. The state of the nation, an annual report in ever-decreasing circles. The wheels of fortune, the cycles of despair. There's a cool poem about tree rings. But what do tree rings do for us, moving away from the arts and back to science? Well, they give us a very clear record of the climate of the past because of the widths and the changes of the favorability of the growing season. I won't go into all the details associated with this, but by measuring the widths of those growth rings, we get some unique insights that we can correlate with climate. And much like what I was pointing out with the advancements we've made through incorporating technology, we've done the same thing in the tree ring world. In the tree ring world, we've taken thousands of individuals' efforts, put them together into large databases, in this case called the International Tree Ring Database, something along the lines of 6,000 to 7,000 observations in this database, in which as somebody such as myself, I can go to this online and freely download tree ring data for basically any place. Well, you can see that there's large areas where we don't have observations, like Africa. Africa is often a place that we lack good scientific data. But for most of the continents and for many of the countries, we have solid data on tree ring records. And when you combine this kind of coverage spatially with the temporal depth that you get from tree ring data, we can produce proxies of climate to fill our lack of knowledge of what's going on prior to the instrumental record. So this plot is basically showing current day here on the right, 1,000 years back on the left. This red line basically represents the instrumental record, and it stops about 1900. Instrumental record in this case would be meteorological observations from weather stations. And prior to that, how do we know about what the climate system has done? Well, tree rings play a big part of that going back. We can use tree rings as a proxy, along with other proxies, to reconstruct climate changes, in this case, northern hemisphere temperature anomalies, so how temperatures have differed from a reference period of 1960 to 1990 in this case. And one of the things you can see in this plot as well, the gray area basically shows our uncertainty in the estimates, and as you go further back in time, it blows up. But that's being honest to the data. Let's go back further. What about the distant past, beyond 1,000 years or so? This is where pollen, yet another gift from trees to the world, unless you have hay fever, comes in handy. They actually are quite beautiful when you look at them under these types of scanning electron microscopes. But pollen really is just tree love. And the thing that people who have allergies hate about it is what makes it perfect for what I'm going to talk about now. Pollen blows everywhere. It can travel for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and it can deposit into places that basically accrue it and use it as a record of the types of vegetation that were there in the past. These are examples of the types of sediment cores that people pull out of bogs, lakes, meadows, fens, basically depositional environments that are going to accumulate pollen. And scientists, including scientists here at the University of Montana, I'm not one of them, I don't have the patience, they take cross-sections from this and they painstakingly count pollen grains, type them to either genus or species level to understand what was there in the past. When you look at a sediment core like this, the top is the present day, and as you work your way down, you're looking back in the time. And so they have clever ways to age different depths in those sediment cores and then understand what's the pollen that was there. And so if you're going back 7,000 years and you see that you have pine pollen, you know something about the climate that occurred 7,000 years ago at that site. And if you go back another 10,000 years to about 17,000 years ago, and then you see that it was western red cedar pollen, you knew that it was a wet environment at that point, much cooler. And so that type of depth of time is unprecedented. And even to this day, pollen records are still producing some of the top science that our fields know. Scientists, yet again, are marrying this painstaking effort of counting pollen grains in sediment cores with modern technology to bring this data to bear to understand problems over large scale. This is a Neotoma database. This is a database of paleoecological records, many of which are pollen records at over 15,000 sites, over 4 million observations around the globe, one spot in Africa. At any of those places, you know where the location is, you know what the current climate is, and you can drill down, in some cases, 20,000 years or even longer to understand how do the vegetation communities at those places change, including the forest types. And so it's an unprecedented view in terms of what the past has held. This is some of the kinds of information you can gain from this kind of data. So this is Thuja plicata, western red cedar. I was just talking about it. We find it now on coastal forests. We also find it here in some northern Idaho in the bottom of ravines, wet places. This is where its current present-day distribution is. But if we go back to the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago, that's the extent of the ice sheet in white, and you can see that its distribution was shifted far south in terms of where it was located. Here's ponderosa pine, tree I know and love. Here's its current distribution. Here's what it looked like 21,000 years ago based on the reconstructions from pollen records and other models. You see that it basically was found in the southwest and down into Mexico. And so these kinds of information gives us, it completely changes our perspectives on the permanence of forests. We see that over the last 21,000 years ago, what we think are pretty static, stable systems have actually changed quite dramatically. They've moved hundreds of kilometers in latitude. They've reshifted and restructured the types of species that you find. The pollen records tells us that there were forests in the past that we have no analog for today. There were mixtures of species we do not see on the landscape today. And so that kind of information is really powerful for understanding the forces of change associated with changes in climate of the past. And given that I think pollen is that cool, here's a poem to pollen. Pollen. And this dust survives through the death of ages. It sleeps in deep layers of mud, black, red, and umber. It sleeps under the wet pelt of a November hill, where long grass is the color of fox. It sleeps deep under lakes. 12 meters down it survives. Dust of Arctic meadows, old and tough as love. We've talked about the past. What about the future? I put this figure or this image up here not because I'm particularly a fan of this movie, but because I like the title, Back to the Future. We, as scientists, don't have the liberty of making a DeLorean into a time machine to understand what the future looks like. We have to basically go back to the past and understand how things have changed over long time frames in the past and in the recent past to understand what we think is going to happen in the future. We have some ideas from that paleo record, from what we see on the landscape today as to what the future might hold for our forests. This plot basically is showing a cartoon of what climate space looks like for a number of forest trees species across the globe. We have temperature over here on the y-axis, cooler to warmer water or precip, here on the x-axis, wetter to drier. So here's the current climate, and as things get warmer and drier, it's going to shift. And so the question is, are we going to cross a threshold in which we have trees now on landscapes that can't actually make a living? We move past their ability to move water, to regenerate, to do the things that trees need to do. One thing we can do is ask the question right now is, are we seeing the type of mortality that this simple cartoon predicts might be happening out in the world now? And the answer is yes. There are forests all around the globe. This is a recent study that basically pulled together studies globally that looked at drought-induced and heat-induced mortality in forests around the globe. And we see that all the main continents have forests that are basically dying due to drought and drought-induced stress. So it's occurring now. Some of the questions that we have are, will it accelerate? Will it happen in the future? We're doing some interesting science here at the University of Montana related to this. One of the things that we know is that trees don't always start out as big organisms, these epic things. They start as little vulnerable seedlings. And this seedling is far more sensitive to changes in climate and drought stress than a large tree because it doesn't have its roots down into groundwater. We take that information and basically information about first principles, about how water moves through systems, physical models that we're developing here, as well as other people are looking at these types of problems, to understand how is it that water moves from the soil through the plant into the atmosphere. How hard is it to pull that water through that tree? That basically represents the tension in that plant and the ability of that plant to basically resist cavitation or things that will kill that tree. We can model that using physical models, models that basically physicists have developed a long time ago. Here's a cover of Physics World in 2018. I can't read the particular month, but it tells you a lot. Physicists are interested in plants because they have a bearing on the well-being of the world. The types of models I was just describing, they're the same kind of models that describe electric current through circuits. The types of equations have similarities. You have a gradient from low to high, in this case from high amount of water to low amount of water, high amount of water in the soil to low amount of water in the atmosphere. You have a tension that pulls that water through that plant, and you have resistance along the way, much like you have resistance in wires. And so we can model the physical system and we can make forecasts, or we can simulate what we think our expectations are about what the world today looks like in terms of the ability of plants to regenerate, as well as what the future might look like. And there's, of course, the challenge of actually asking the question, does your model have any skill? We do experiments to answer these kinds of questions. We grow hundreds of seedlings and then we kill them, unfortunately, all in the name of science. We dry them down, we measure in painstaking detail, yet again, physiological measurements on each of these seedlings to understand how is it that they die. Does our model predict how they died, when they died, and under what conditions that will occur? We really are interested in where can forests of the future regenerate, because if you can't regenerate, all hope is lost. let's take a step back and talk about the carbon cycle, and then I'll wrap up, hopefully soon. Why does any of this matter? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, trees really are this massive sink for carbon on the planet. They have permanence in terms of their longevity, pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in this, basically in wood, for long periods of time. And the majority of that stock is basically sitting in these forests around the globe. And so we have concerns about the permanence of those forests. We are leveraging the same kinds of technologies to understand those threats to those carbon stocks. This is an effort between the University of Maryland and Google to map forest loss around the globe at an unprecedented detail in terms of resolution, spatial resolution and temporal resolution. So this map's basically showing in red, where you see red, is forest loss between 2000 and 2018. The technology that allows this map to be produced comes from NASA. So I'll thank all of you guys again for paying your taxes and funding NASA. Earth observational data over long records allows us to make these types of observations to say something about forests, where we're losing them and where we're gaining them. The resolution of these pixels in this map is roughly 100 feet, all around the globe. And so it's a massive amount of data. How do you handle data like that? Well, you partner with a company like Google. And luckily, they were willing to do that partnership. And so now you can go online to Global Forest Change, to this website, and you can look up any specific year you want and ask, how much forest was lost this specific year? You can zoom in on your favorite neck of the woods and see what was lost, what was gained. We also know that fire activity is changing with climate. And so we can also thank NASA for being able to tell us about where fires are around the globe. I'm not going to bother to try to actually play the movie. But basically, Earth observational data from satellites gives us information about where fires are around the globe at high temporal resolution. We know where fires are happening, where they're basically destroying the carbon stocks that we're talking about. This is a budget, after all. We're interested in knowing what's gained and what's lost. Was it actually? Yeah, I guess it's going now. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up basically where I started in western Montana in a ponderosa pine forest in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. So I've been studying or working in forests for about 20 years, a little over 20 years now. It's not that long. There are people who've been doing it a lot longer, but I've learned a few things. I learned that there's a lot I don't know about trees and how they work, how forests work. I think trees are spectacular. I often get asked by friends and family, like, am I depressed about what the future holds? Or am I concerned? And I would say, absolutely, I'm concerned. We have many reasons to be concerned about what the forests of the future look like. As a father, I have many concerns. I want my kids to be able to go find doorways to new worlds, just like John Muir wrote about. I will leave you with a famous poem about a tree by Joyce Kilmer. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to field questions if you have them.
Solomon?
Yeah.
I posted underneath the last post I did telling people to show up tonight. That didn't work. No. But it was a CNN article about planting 1 trillion trees, and when I asked you about that earlier, you said we really need 2 trillion. But how much is planting trees, presumably in places where they will survive in 50 years? How much, is that a big part of an answer, or are we whistling into the wind, or?
There's actually been a lot of work trying to ask the questions of what are the biophysical impacts of planting trees and having trees on landscapes. Trees, of course, sequester carbon, but trees also make the area around them darker, and so they change the energy budget. And so I don't actually know the answer to your question. Maybe Steve knows. I think that the jury is still out. There are basically conflicting ideas. The last that I've read about this says that in some places, planting trees actually has a net positive gain in terms of the effects on the energy budget. In other places, it can have a negative effect because creating a darker canopy absorbs more energy that basically can heat the surrounding environment. I personally don't think that we are going to solve this problem by planting 1 trillion trees. I think we need to save the trees that we currently have, because we can plant 1 trillion trees and you can have plantations as far as you can see, but they don't actually amount to the types of forests that we see natively, natural forests that we see across the landscape now. And so my worry is that if we think that we're going to resolve this by planting trees, I think we lose sight of some of the more important things we gain from forests. They're not just sinks for carbon.
Yeah.
The thing that's missing in the forest climate change equation is the genetical variation that routinely exists within sexually reproducing tree populations, particularly those that have big geographic range limits. I learned this as a student that there was an eastern cedar swamp that I was studying, and then on a lunch break I found the same species on sand dunes on Lake Michigan. I said, what the hell's going on here? Two completely opposite, dry, organic-less soils on the sand dunes, and these soggy, wet, mucky swamps. And then I brought this concept from Madison out here, and I discovered that, and other Forest Service people have discovered that Doug fir has ecotypic variation, genetic variation, but I'm not ready to accept the idea that forests are going to be replaced by grasslands until those ecotypes within the pines or some of the other species in the West have probably lost some of the members that are adapted to warmer, drier, and they are very few in number. But as their habitats expand, warmer and drier, their numbers will increase. Then finally, if we do get to the end of the century, maybe things will be even too bad for that component. But there is this genetic component in the equation, or should be, in terms of plants and animals that sexually reproduce and have this range variation. Remember, after World War II, 1/10 of 1% of flies survived DDT. And they reproduce all the others. So I'm just saying, where would you consider genetics, or do you include that in your presentations too?
I don't include presentations related to genetics to crowds that are the general public, because I think your point is well taken. I made a comment earlier that I get asked whether I have concerns about the future. I do have concerns about the future, but I also have hope about the future because of some of the things you just described. The paleo record gives you a unique insight in terms of the capacity of organisms to basically deal with dramatic changes of climate in the past. But your point is an important point. There is dramatic variation in the genomes of trees, particularly conifers. Conifers, not only do they have broad genetic variation, they often have replicate copies of their genome. And so they are very amenable to basically having that kind of really broad diversity. And we're only scratching at the surface now, trying to understand how diverse these types of organisms are. And the key thing we don't understand yet is how much of that diversity actually is adaptive. There can be lots of diversity. There can be multiple copies of a genome, but it's not clear how much of it can actually be used to basically handle this new environments that are coming along. That said, you were right. You can look at a lot of tree species. We don't have to go look at the types that you were talking about. We can look at, for example, lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine has dramatic genetic variation in it. You see variation in terms of how it responds to fire, whether it immediately releases seeds or not. You see the types that you see in Northern California or in California in the Sierras look nothing like the types of lodgepole that we see here. They are stately trees that stand out in the open on bare rock landscapes. Big trees. Here, they're dog hair thickets. And so there is dramatic variation. We are including some of this kind of information. And so the experiments that I was showing you, or at least showing you some images of, we did look at some differences between pine races from the coastal regions of the country to the inland regions, inland Rockies. And we know that there are different subtypes in those populations, and they have different resistance to drought. And so we are thinking about those things, but this is an area, so landscape genetics is an area of growth. People are increasingly trying to understand what is the intrinsic capacity of these trees to change.
I don't know if I could ask you, but other members of the Campus Arboretum Committee might understand the possibility of introducing different components of a genetically diverse tree population. But people might say, well, that's Pinus contorta, and that's also Pinus contorta, and that one over there is Pinus contorta. And then Kelly would have to say, no, but that's from 6,000 feet, and that's from 4,000 feet, and that's from 9,000 feet timberline.
Well, there are accepted different...
There's some crumholes trees on campus, which are...
The hard thing would be to keep them crumholes.
Well, the point is, it's hard to know what... If we're just doing Latin names versus the ecological.
There are certain boundaries where you can point to on landscapes right now where we don't expect trees to be able to basically have the intrinsic variability to go past that. When you, for example, look at landscapes around us now and you see lower tree lines, places where you transition from grasslands into forest lands, those places have distinct biophysical limitations on the ability of trees to regenerate. One of the things that we did with the data that some of the experiments that I was showing you in the model that I was briefly describing was that we took that model and we basically simulated where can ponderosa pine regenerate across the Bitterroot Valley. So as if you just wiped off the trees, all the trees off the Bitterroot Valley, and planted a bunch of little one-year-old pine trees that we were basically modeling using our model that we had calibrated from those greenhouse experiments. So we said, where are the conditions lethal for ponderosa pine and where are they not? And when we do that simulation, we found that it lines up really nicely with where lower tree line is, because it is right there. It's right there in front of you. You can walk into the forest here in the southern Bitterroot, you walk into stands of stately old pine trees, and guess what? There aren't any regen in the understory. And so we're right at this margin of where you can support trees and where you can't. And so my guess is that you could go other places and get more drought-tolerant pine strains, ponderosa pine strains, and put them there. You're still going to have struggle getting them to regenerate. And the Forest Service, the people who are tasked with replanting forests after fires, I mean, look, 2017, 1 million acres in Montana burned, a lot of this dry pine forest. They got to make decisions. Where do we get the seed stock, and do we think it's going to actually regenerate? Otherwise, it's a waste of money.
So have you identified the lethal threshold or water potential for those seedlings dying?
Yes.
I tried 50 years ago and I couldn't do it.
So we have strategies that we're working on now using basically plant hydraulic models to get at it. So we use a vulnerability curve, which is basically looking at your mortality against your soil moisture conditions, and we use that within that modeling framework to. And I could send you the paper that we published just last year on this topic. And
we're around -5 megapascals.
Is it around minus? I think it's actually a bit higher than that, or
really?
Not higher, so lower tensions than
right,
that.
lower.
Yeah. it's really, we use percent loss of conductivity as a currency that we're
Okay.
interested in.
You
not-
didn't know how to do that.
Yeah, so now we do. And so, this is work with Anna Sala, who's a really talented a physiologist here at the University of Montana, as well as Marco Moneta, who's a really talented ecohydrologist. And so what we did is we did these measurements that allowed us to calibrate these models within that greenhouse. And then the thing that was really superb about it is that, so we calibrated the model from the greenhouse set of measurements. And when you have a model that's really sophisticated like that, it's got 30 parameters or more, lots of knobs to tune. And you can get it to fit the data when you have 30 knobs to tune. And I wasn't surprised that I could get it to fit the results of mortality in the greenhouse. But then what we didn't know is, can we take that model and go out into a real landscape and say, does it have any skill? And we took that model without any subsequent tuning on the physiological parameters and went out and applied it to the example I just described about lower tree line, as well as sites that the Forest Service had been keeping track of mortality. And we showed, wow, it had skill. And that, I thought, was actually quite surprising. Yeah.
This is just a general climate change question. Did you mention earlier, what is your response when you have a person challenge you saying that climate change is a naturally occurring cycle?
What's my response? I basically claim that the support for their position isn't supported by the science. I mean, I don't want to get into the politics associated with this because this isn't an appropriate venue for that. But I think that it's important to push back when I think that I can actually make headway. If the person I'm discussing with expresses interest, like clear interest about the topics, I will try to convey my knowledge of that information. If it's clear to me that this isn't a discussion that they want to have or open to, being receptive to information, then I'm not going to engage in that discussion.
It's very civil of you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. Since methane is 40 times as dangerous for climate change as carbon dioxide, anyone found any trees that sequester methane?
Wow, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that methane, like biochemically, I don't think that it would enter into the leaves in the same way and get sequestered, but I could be completely wrong about it. I mean, there are specific pathways within photosynthesis that sequester CO2, and I don't think that methane allows for that, but that would be speculation at this point because I'm not familiar with the biochemistry of it. I've never heard anything about it. You'd think that if plants were sequestering methane, they'd be really flammable, for one thing. Yeah, question?
Your forest loss map,
Yeah.
is that associated with fires?
No, a lot of that is basically land use change, land conversion. It actually probably does include loss to fire, but it's a more broad spectrum. It's just basically where you had trees at one point and where you don't afterwards.
So I didn't see what that range
It was from which time to which time, but it showed the southeast and it showed the northwest.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering.
So it was 2000 to 2018 was a time interval in which that map-specific screen capture represented, and in the southeast there's active fires. A lot of people don't necessarily know that there's really active fire regimes in the southeast in the Pine Barrens. There's also a lot of harvesting that goes on. So there are major timber companies that harvest in those areas. So that's probably explaining a lot of the patterns there. And in the Pacific Northwest, you have the same drivers as well.
So you're thinking logging.
Logging,
And
yeah.
thick forest.
The resolution of that particular product allows for looking at basically loss in small areas associated with logging. And it was particularly relevant for the tropics because in the tropics you need that type of resolution to see the type of logging that's occurring. You often have basically people coming in and poaching specific trees and pulling them out and degrading lands.
It was kind of interesting because the southeast was so bright, whatever
Red.
it was,
Mhm.
red for loss.
Yeah.
And then it showed up as this heavy fire.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was just the way the globe was, but it didn't really show very much fire on the west coast, which was great.
Yeah, the projections were, but there's plenty out here as well, as you guys well know.
Oh, that's kind of weird, but I just didn't
Yeah.
expect it in the southeast.
It's important to keep in mind, though, that when we're talking about forest gain and loss, it's like a budget. And so we can keep track of losses, but to do it right, you got to keep track of the stuff going into the account as well, which is the gains. And there are gains as well. There's evidence that there is greening going on globally, on a global scale, as in terms of things getting more extensive, particularly because of basically old brownfields going back in the forests on the East Coast, reclamation of lands in China and so forth. And so those types of land cover changes, that budget is an important thing. That's just showing the loss component of it.
That global forest change that you did display, what was that, the Earth engine?
That was all based off of Earth Engine. And so it was Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland in conjunction with some of Google's scientists with Earth Engine that really kind of pioneered the scale at which you can start doing that. And that was a really eye-opening study for a lot of us that recognize, wow, Google is basically opening the door to a new world in terms of geospatial analyses. When I was a student, a grad student, it took us weeks, painstaking, Steve will tell you all about it. The effort that it took to basically take lots of different images and mosaic them, radiometrically correct them, make it so that you can actually do scientific measurements with them. It was a big lift. And what Google has done is in a single hand is just erased all that requirements and allows basically me to sit down and take advantage of the entire Earth observation record from Landsat, from MODIS, and all of that pre-processing is gone. It's done behind the scenes on their servers. It really is a watershed moment in terms of the types of geospatial analysis that we can do.
You spoke a lot of the research on it, sounds like just natural forest types. Is there some overflow into urban ecology and what's going on with canopy cover over urban areas? How does that, some of your...
My guess is that I don't really, I'm not that well versed in urban ecology. My guess is that if you were to go to Thursday's talk, I think that there's going to be discussion about trees. Oh, okay, great. I'm going to ask you. Tell me about urban ecology. They are. We clearly know what the issues are within urban systems in terms of heat island effects, and we also know that trees can really help ameliorate those effects. And so, I think increasingly cities are looking to plant trees in order to kind of address some of those impacts of warming. What I don't know is, are there any long-term trends associated with what's going on in these systems, within urban systems?
Do you find, because a lot of what your mapping is showing is kind of, it's species migration, where you see the trends of the species going north. And what we're noticing just with some of the research is that there's also a resistance to allowing the species into these areas because people aren't, they're like, this isn't native, or this shouldn't be here in this area. And so we're just kind of seeing some groups saying, these trees shouldn't be here. So it's just an interesting concept.
Yeah. There's actually a lot of resistance to what you're talking about, not just within urban systems, but in natural systems as well. And so this idea of promoting connectivity or moving organisms around to facilitate or help these systems adapt to incoming climate changes, it's a controversial topic in ecological literature, particularly talking about moving organisms, threatened organisms. We do not have a we do not have a good history of favorable outcomes when we move organisms to places that they historically weren't. We've done a lot of damage to ecosystems, to put it lightly, and so I could see why there's resistance, but at the same time, there are open questions about, are organisms going to be able to keep pace with the rate of change? I get that question often as well. Things have always changed. You showed us the record. It bounces around a lot. Why are we concerned? Well, the rate of change now is pretty dramatic compared to what we've seen in the past. And additionally, maybe more importantly, in the past, organisms could move and migrate over landscapes without a lot of obstruction. Now our landscapes are completely fragmented. They're human-modified landscapes. If you're sitting on top of a mountain on a sky island in the southwest, and you need to get to another sky island to the north of you, you got, a lot of inhospitable terrain in between. You got desert, you got suburban developments, on. And so the connectivity across landscapes is drastically reduced compared to what we assume it was in the past. And so that has a big implication for this. Yeah.
My understanding was that lots of the tropical forests were the biggest impact of the forest change. Is that still the case, or is there some shift?
Tropical forests are basically the lungs of the planet. They have dramatically more carbon than temperate forests. And so, yeah, what happens in tropic forests is going to have much more dramatic implications. That said, we know that temperate forests do have implications in terms of the variability of the carbon cycle. But in overall magnitude of fluxes, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but tropical forests are the big heavies in this.
And luckily, they grow back pretty fast.
Yeah, they're productive, and so they get cut down, they grow back. I mean, one of the key things is that tropical forests, much of their nutrients are basically in the canopy itself. Their soils are often not very fertile, and so it takes that kind of that biological inertia to get going, but it comes back. So
Countries are a little more environmentally aware. Not enough.
Did you see Borneo on that map? It's like all red pretty much.
yeah, or consider Brazil and the things that are going on there.
Indonesia.
Yeah.
So there's some countries that not.
By and large, countries near the equator, where the tropics are, generally have lower GDPs and have lower ability to deal with the kinds of problems that we're talking about. In fact, I think there was just a paper published very recently. Noah Diffenbaugh from Stanford basically published a paper basically showing that the countries that have had the least impact on the carbon budget, the negative impacts, are paying the highest prices for it. Anything else? Thank you, guys.